The book I want to talk about today is Radical Respect, which is a book I wrote just after Radical Candor, but in many ways I should have written it before. It is the prequel to Radical Candor. I decided to write this book when I got some feedback on Radical Candor. If you write a book about feedback, you're bound to get a lot of it, and indeed I did. And hands down, the most helpful feedback I got about Radical Candor came when I was presenting at a company where the CEO had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade. She's a person I like enormously. Really excited to go talk to her team. When I was finished, she pulled me aside and she said, "Kim, I'm excited to roll out. Radical Candor on my team, but I got to tell you, it's much harder for me than it is for you." And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer people even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, they would call her an angry Black woman. And I knew this was true, and I knew how unfair it is. She's literally one of the most reasonable, cheerful people I've ever worked with. And as soon as she said it to me, I had a bunch of different realizations. The biggest one being that I had not been the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be. I'd failed to be an upstander. I had failed to take into account the toll it must have to take on her to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting she was ever in. And I promised myself I wanted to do better. So I spent some time thinking about what would cause people to treat her so disrespectfully, and also why had I not noticed. And that was what really prompted me to write this book. Before I share with you the framework for this book, I want to kind of double click on the word respect, because it has two very different meanings. One meaning of respect is about admiration for someone elicited by their abilities or their achievements. That is not what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm talking about is the second definition of words are very confusing, as you writers know. They often have so many different meanings. But what I'm talking about is the unconditional regard that we all owe each other for each other's feelings, rights, and traditions. So respect in this sense is not something that has to be earned. It's kind of a birthright. It's something that we all owe one another. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's think about what it is that creates respect and what gets in the way. You know me, I love a good 2x2. So radical respect, that kind of environment is created where everyone, not only the leaders, but everyone on the team is optimizing for collaboration rather than coercion. It's a collaboration hierarchy, not a dominance hierarchy. And it's also one where everyone is honoring everyone else's individuality rather than demanding conformity. And I think that most leaders intend to create this kind of environment, and most of their employees also intend to create this kind of environment. I don't know about you all, but I don't know anyone who woke up this morning saying, "I want to work in a coercive work environment," or "I want to coerce my colleagues." I think most of us intend to collaborate. And I also don't know anyone who woke up this morning. I'm sure these people are out there, but I just don't know them. Hopefully you all don't either. But I'm open to feedback on this. But I don't know anybody who woke up this morning and said, "What I really want is to create a dystopic 1984 style, everybody's been marching in lockstep kind of work environment." So we have good intentions around creating a respectful work environment. And yet so often we wind up with these disrespectful work environments. And when we're optimizing for conformity and coercion, we get what I call brutal incompetence. Obviously, that's not what we're shooting for. So what gets in the way? Given that most people intend to create this kind of environment, what gets in the way of radical respect? There's a million things, but I'm going to boil it down to three: bias, prejudice, and bullying. And I think that very often one of the problems here is that we conflate these three things as though they're the same thing, when in fact they're three very different things. And all of us on this call, we're problem solvers. And what do problem solvers do when faced with a hard problem? Break it down into its component parts. So I want to offer some probably overly simple definitions for each of these words so that we can keep them straight when we're in the heat of the moment, when we're not sure what's going on. So bias is not meaning it. So I'm really talking about unconscious bias here. Whereas prejudice is meaning it. Prejudice is a very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And bullying is not about a belief, conscious or unconscious, it's just about being mean. And one of the problems when one of these things rears its ugly head in a meeting is that it's hard to know what to say. Drop into the chat how many of you have been in a meeting, even in the last week, where somebody said or did something that was so cringeworthy it made you want to crawl under the table, but you didn't know what to say, so you didn't say anything at all, and then it woke you up at 3 in the morning. Anybody been in that situation? Yes, I see some yeses. So I'm not promising to solve all the world's problems in the next 10 minutes, but hopefully some of the suggestions here will help you deal with those moments better so that you don't wake up at 3 in the morning kicking yourself. So if the problem is bias, I recommend an I response. An example of this came from a colleague of mine who walked into a meeting, and she was the one who had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. So she sat at the center of the table, and her two colleagues, both of whom were men, sat to her left. When the other side came in, the first person sat across from the guy to her left, the next person sat across from the guy to his left, and then everybody else filed on down the table, leaving her dangling by herself. And that's often how bias shows up, just who decides to sit where. She was undeterred. She started talking. And then when the people on the other side of the table had questions, they didn't direct them at her, they directed them at her two colleagues who were men. Anybody ever notice this happen? It happened once, it happened twice, and then the third time it happened, one of her colleagues stood up and he said, "I think we should switch seats." That was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. It was use that kind of I response. He was sort of like holding up a mirror to the other side. And he did that for a bunch of reasons. The first reason that he did it was that he liked her and it bothered him to see her get ignored. But he also did it for a very practical, not just an emotional reason, but a practical reason. He wanted to win the deal, and he knew they wouldn't win the deal if the other side wouldn't listen to her. He also did it sort of out of compassion for the people who had been biased, because he knew that, like, it could have been him. We all, maybe he wouldn't have done that exact thing, but we all have biases. And he also knew that it would probably be easier for them to hear it from him. And fourthly, he did it for himself. He didn't want to wake up 3 in the morning kicking himself for not having said anything. So that's an example of using an I response if you notice bias. It sort of holds up a mirror and invites the other person in to understand the situation from your perspective. However, if it's prejudice, holding up a mirror is not going to work, because the person's going to grin in the mirror. Yeah, they're going to like what they see. Aren't I good looking? So in the case of prejudice, what you need is an it response. An it response draws a very clean line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose that belief on others. An it response can appeal to a law, it can appeal to company policy, or it can appeal to common sense. An example of an it response, I had an opportunity to use an it response shortly after I returned to work after parental leave. I'd been out for 5 months. This was my second day back in the office. I was having all the feelings that one has at that moment. And I was chit-chatting with a guy before meeting, and he said, "Oh, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children." And for me at this moment, that was like a punch in the gut. But I didn't think he really meant it the way it sounded. I thought it was probably biased. So I tried an I response, and I said, "Oh, I decided to show up at work today because I wanted to neglect my children." And I was expecting him to laugh and we would move on, but no, he doubled down and he said, "Oh no, Kim, it is really bad for your children that you decided to come back to work. And now I know this is not bias. This is a very firmly held prejudice that he has. There are, it might have been better for his family situation for his wife not to work, but it definitely was not better for my situation, for me not to work. And so now I need an it response. So I started with company policy and I said, it is an HR violation for you to tell me that I am neglecting my kids by not showing up at work today. And that had the desired impact. He kind of stepped back, looking a little alarmed. And then I tried again and I said, it's not necessary for us to make a thing of this with HR, but I think we can agree that it is my decision, together with my partner, how we raise our children, just as it is your decision, together with your wife, how you raise your children. And I could tell, he still wasn't totally sold on this. And I said, furthermore, it's my guess you don't want to read my research any more than I want to read your research. And then he laughed, agreed, and we were able to work together better. And that was important because if I had said nothing, first of all, I would have resented him and I would have been mad at him and it would have been hard for me to work well with him. But also, if I had said nothing, there's some possibility that he would have prevented me. If he didn't think I should work, he definitely didn't think I should travel, and he could have prevented me from getting certain work that was going to require travel. So very important that I responded. And by the way, I didn't really, the way I told the story, I act like I responded perfectly. It didn't really go down quite that way. But anyway, that's how I wish I responded. All right, last but not least, bullying. In the case of bullying, if you show a bully, if you show someone who's trying to bully you where a boundary is, they are probably going to just try to kick past it. So an it response is not going to work. And if an I response draws someone in closer to you to understand things from your perspective, that's not really what you want to do with a bully. You want to kind of push them away. So in the case of bullying, you want a you response. Something like, you can't talk to me like that, or what's going on for you here? Or even sort of, you don't usually act this way. What's happening here? Or even a you non sequitur, like, where'd you get that shirt? That just changes the topic. You're now not responding to what they dished out at you. You're not in a submissive role, you're in an active role. I learned this from my daughter when she was in third grade and she was getting bullied on the playground. And I encouraged her to use an I response. I said, oh, tell this kid, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. She rolled her eyes. She banged her hand on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? I was like, oh, that's a really good point. So you don't want to make yourself more vulnerable to someone who is trying to bully you. You want to just push them off. And I think a you response can be helpful. So again, I'm not saying that this is gonna solve all the world's problems, but if you're in that moment and you're not sure what to say or do, decide what you think is happening. And you don't have to be right about it. Maybe you think it's bias, but it's actually prejudice, like I learned. But you'll learn something if you start by saying, if you think it's bias, start with the word I, something else will come out of your mouth. If you think it's prejudice, start with the word it, and something else will come out of your mouth. If you think it's bullying, start with the word you, something else will come out of your mouth. Sometimes figuring out what to say is just a momentum game, and you got to start with a word. I hope this helps a little bit. I'd love to pause here and take time for questions. And then if we have time, I'll talk about different things you can do depending on whether you're the upstander or the leader or the person at whom this stuff was directed, or maybe you even said or did the disrespectful thing. But I'm gonna stop sharing for a moment, and I'm gonna take a look at the chat and the QA and see what you all think. See what your questions are. And if you don't have any, I've got another 15 minutes of stuff. All right, there's no question, so I'm going to keep going, but feel free to interrupt me and we can pause and talk. This is a lot to take in, I know. By the way, if you don't feel like asking questions in a public way, you can ask in private. I can't help myself. I'm sitting here in Silicon Valley, so I have made an AI bot of myself using the books and using my podcast and using our blogs. So if you go to bot.radicalcandor.ai, you can talk to me 24/7. I'm not promising the bot is perfect, but it's pretty damn good, I have to say. All right. So what are the practical, tactical things you can do depending on what role you play? And we all play multiple roles multiple times a day, and we all have a role to play in solving these problems. First of all, leaders. It's a leader's job to prevent bias, prejudice, and bullying from messing up the dynamic on their teams. And so there are different things that leaders can do depending on what is going on. In the case of bias, I recommend uh, working with your team to come up with a quick correction, and it shouldn't be all on you. You want to teach your team to disrupt bias in the moment. I like to, my team and I will wave a purple flag if we notice somebody saying or doing something. Another team that I worked on had this situation of red words where they sat down and they said, what's the word or phrase that if one of us uses it, you're not going to hear anything else we say for the next couple of days. Everybody has a red word like that. And not everybody is aware of other people's red words. That is the very definition of unconscious bias. And it can be really helpful, I think, to know what other people's uh, what's gonna just make it difficult to work with you if you use these words. You don't have to know every single unconscious bias that exists in the world. There's too many. None of us can. But I think all of us must be aware of the biases that are happening in the room and the things that we are saying that are causing unintended offense for the people who we work with. If it's prejudice, you need to create a space for conversation. In order for everyone to know, to recognize prejudice and to know what the rules are, you need to talk about what are the HR policy, what are the norms that you all want to create on your team so that you know where that line is. It's very easy for me to sit here and say there's a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose those beliefs on others. But every company, every team draws that line in a slightly different place. And I'm not here to say where the line must be. The most important thing is that where it is should be clear, and it should be clear to all of you. And even if there are clear policies, often people don't know what they mean or how they're implemented. So think about, and in the book Radical Respect, I write down some situations that happened on other teams. You can read those situations together and say, how would we handle this? And last but not least, bullying. It is a leader's job to create consequences for bullying. You've got to create conversational consequences. You need to learn how to shut it down in the moment. You need to create compensation consequences. You don't want to give high ratings to people on your team who bully others. Because if you reward that kind of behavior, not only will you get more of it, it's going to escalate until it causes a real problem. And last but not least, you've got to create career consequences for bullying. If you have someone on your team who is apt to bully others, whatever you do, don't promote them. There comes a moment on too many teams' histories when the jerks begin to win. And that is the moment when the culture begins to lose. So don't promote them. Let them know that this behavior is a career limiting move. And if they give them feedback, sometimes people aren't aware of the impact of their behavior. So you want to give people a chance to improve. And then you want to let them know if they can't improve, not only will they not get promoted, but you'll actually fire them. And this is hard. I think very often people are afraid to fire someone on their team, even though they're hurting other people. Maybe they're getting some results in their own area. And all I have to say about that is that you're way better off having a hole than an asshole. So it is your job. It is your job to make sure. And the reason it's your job as a leader is because when one person is bullying others, maybe they're getting results, but they're preventing 5 other people from getting results. And that's a net negative on a team. All right. What do you do if you're the upstander? If you're the person who observed this thing happening and you don't want to be a silent bystander, then obviously it's your job to intervene in some way. And there's a lot of different ways to intervene. I'm gonna highlight 5 that an organization called Right to Be calls the 5 Ds. The first is direct. You can say something directly, like the guy who said, "I think we should switch seats." You can also delay. It was pretty clever that he thought to do that. Sometimes you're not, you can't think of what to say or do in the moment. Or maybe you feel like you might even make the situation if you say or do something. It's also fine simply to check in with the person who was on the receiving end of this disrespectful attitude or behavior. One time in my career, I was giving a presentation with 2 colleagues, both of whom were men, to this big team. It's like 5,000 people. So we get on stage, and the leader of this team introduces my first colleague, shakes his hand, introduces my second colleague, shakes his hand, and then introduces me. And I stuck my hand out for him to shake it, and instead he grabs it and he kisses it, kind of licked it, basically, left spit on the other side. It was a gross moment, not the end of the world, but also not my favorite moment. But what was even worse than what happened was the fact that not a single person came up to me afterwards and said, "That was weird," or "Do you need some hand sanitizer?" And so then I started to almost like gaslight myself. What, am I was I overly was I being overly sensitive or whatever? All the things we tell ourselves. So just checking in with someone can be a great way to intervene. You can also create a distraction. Spill your coffee. Maybe that gives the person on the receiving end the ability to regain composure. You can delegate. You can find someone else, catch someone else's eye, and ask them to intervene. Don't, like, sometimes what happens when you get the silent bystander effect is everybody is so horrified and nobody's looking at anybody else. Everybody's pretending that nothing is happening, and that only makes the situation worse. And last but not least, you can document. We're all carrying these movie cameras around in our pocket with us. So remember, you can write down. You can also just jot down what happened. But remember that the person who was harmed by the disrespect owns that documentation. Don't just go posting it on social media. So those are some thoughts on how to make sure that you are an upstander, not a bystander. The most important thing, I think, is don't default to silence. It's awkward, but you've got to push through. The only way out is through. Next, let's talk about what happens when I'm the one who said or did the disrespectful thing, or you're the one who said or did the disrespectful thing. Here, it's our responsibility to acknowledge what we did wrong and to make amends. I think that this is, at least for me, this is really hard. This is really hard because I feel so ashamed when I get feedback that I've said or done something that's disrespectful. And I can tell you where I feel it in my body. It's like a tingling in the backs of my knees. It's the same physical sensation that I get if my children walk too close to the edge of a precipice. It's a real fear response. And then my brain goes into fight or flight response, and I'm usually not at my best. None of us are at our best when we're in fight or flight mode. So, what I've tried to do is to teach myself in these moments to say in my head, not out loud, ack. And ack has a very specific meaning. First of all, I need to remember that it's my job to be aware of what I did wrong. Sometimes, and these are really uncomfortable moments, I'll realize that I've offended someone, but I don't even know why. And so now I'm doubly ashamed. I've offended someone, I've hurt their feelings, and I'm ignorant. I don't even know what I did wrong. And it's tempting for me to demand that that person explain it to me. But I try to remember it's my job to educate my own damn self. So I try to figure out how I'm going to become aware. I'm going to talk to someone else. I'm going to, sometimes ChatGPT can be very helpful, or Gemini. I'm going to look it up and describe the situation, what was wrong. Google is an excellent resource to help you become more aware. And then I'm going to acknowledge. I'm going to acknowledge what I did wrong, and I'm going to acknowledge it as publicly as possible. And then I'm going to accept the consequences. Sometimes we fail to acknowledge what we did wrong because we're trying to avoid the consequences. Usually, just accepting the consequences is much better and actually less painful in the end than all the contortions that one goes through to avoid the consequences. And then you're not acknowledging what you did wrong. Maybe even go beyond what the natural consequences would be to make amends. Only then does it make sense to apologize. Because if you apologize before you know what you did wrong, it sounds like a brush off. It sounds like you're just trying to get out of the situation. And last but not least, you got to change. You don't want to keep making the same mistake over and over and over again. I think that the important thing not to do, but the tempting thing to do when we get sort of feedback that we've been disrespectful, it's very tempting to do what psychologist Jennifer Fried calls DARVO, which stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. How, I didn't do that. How dare you accuse me of such a thing? And then I act like I'm the one who's hurt. Very, very human response, but also a very destructive response. So once I find that these kind of acronyms are very helpful to me in recognizing behaviors I don't want to indulge in and to avoid them. All right, last but not least, if you are the person who's on the receiving end of disrespect, you get to choose your battles. But that doesn't mean default to silence. It doesn't mean always choose to say nothing. It means make this a very proactive choice. Because if we always default to silence, and heaven knows I did that very often in my career, is something would happen and I would pretend it hadn't happened. But I found over time the cost of doing that was that I was losing my sense of agency. So I think it's easy to be super aware of the cost of speaking up, but there's also a cost to being silent. So just do a quick mental ROI and figure out, do I want to respond to this or do I not want to respond to this? Remember, I think that's part of what Audre Lorde meant when she said, your silence will not protect you. But that doesn't mean that you don't get to choose your battles. It just means to be aware of that fact. I hope that this will help us all go out and respond to these difficult moments, remembering that we have agency and maybe extending a little bit of grace to the people around us. Thank you all so much. And I'm eager to, I think we're at time, but I'm eager to keep in touch with you all. So feel free to reach out. I'm on LinkedIn. These guys know how to reach me. Thank you all.